4 sins that cry to heaven for vengeance: willful murder, unnatural vice or sodomy, oppression of the poor, widows, and orphans, and finally, defrauding a laborer of his just wages, his or her just wages. The reason that these sins have a special title is that their nature or their malice is so manifest that it provokes divine vengeance more than the other sins. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. With me today to discuss the 4 sins that cry to heaven for vengeance are, first, Father Martin Skierke. This is his first time on What Catholics Believe. Father Skierke is from Great Falls, Montana. And Father William Jenkins, publisher of the Roman Catholic and pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church. Reverend Fathers, in the 4th chapter of Genesis, beginning with verse 10, we read as follows. This is after Cain killed Abel. And he said to him, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth to me from the earth. Now therefore cursed shalt thou be upon the earth, which hath opened her mouth, and received the blood of thy brother at thy hand." We see in our country more and more senseless crimes. People shooting each other over minor traffic accidents, students conspiring to kill teachers over a mild rebuke, and wildly escalating youth gang homicide. I believe that any normal person would experience a shock over such senseless bloodshed. However, euthanasia, and in particular abortion, which claims the lives of 1.5 million each year in the United States alone, are looked upon and aggressively promoted as good things. What must be the state of modern man's soul? Modern man who has distinguished himself by the prodigious shedding of blood.
Well, modern man's soul is alienated from God. Right? Basically, he's just cast off any dependence upon God, and his whole idea is to serve the gods of convenience and comfort. And whatever or whoever threatens convenience and comfort is going to be expendable. That has to do with the unborn child, or the elderly, or the mentally impaired, or whatever. The sad part of it is, of course, it is becoming more and more acceptable. I'm sure, Julius, that there are many, many people in this country, the vast majority of people would be shocked by these drive-by shootings, senseless thrill killings, and so on. Our American people are shocked by that. You know, a case of a Jeffrey Dahmer still awakens a certain horrific dread in the minds of people. And that's why it's splashed all over the newspapers, because it really does shock people, amaze them, but it also holds a certain fascination. And grisly crimes do fascinate us, just as horror movies fascinate us. It's a direct result of original sin. But you know, if you see too much, it begins to have an effect. It begins to have an effect that it shocks less and less. Children growing up in the streets of Beirut over the last 20 years had to step over or run by many bodies while they were playing in the streets. And eventually, you know, they get used to seeing corpses lying around in the street. I hope it never comes to pass in this country that we become accustomed to such, but I'm afraid our people are becoming accustomed to a slaughter, especially of the unborn child.
You know, it's I'm just wondering how much abortion is responsible for these crimes in terms, there's other factors I think which lead to them, but abortion specifically. There was a case in the newspapers where there was a young man and a young lady who were boyfriend and girlfriend, and it turned out they were not married, and the young lady was with child. When the young man who was in school found out about this, he just erupted in a fury. And he insisted that she get an abortion right away. And she said, "No, I can't do that. My mother wouldn't let me, you know, because she was underage still." So he struck her on rage in the head. She lost consciousness, and then I guess in a panic or whatever, he stabbed her twice with a knife, wrapped up her body, and threw it in the ditch. Well, he was discovered, and frankly, I don't think he was a horrible, horrible person. He was, I think, truly remorseful for his crime. Not that he shouldn't be put to death for it, but, you know, be permitted to go to confession beforehand. But I'm just wondering, had there been no such thing as abortion, would that thought have even entered his mind?
Heaven only knows. You know, it's an easy way out in the minds of many people, and they feel that it's a reasonable way to escape from a serious problem which they themselves have caused. You know, getting back to what I was saying before, though, about the horror movies and so on, our young people here are subjected to so much grisly violence on screen that it certainly does have an effect on them.
I was going to ask you about that, Father. As a matter of fact, might lead into my next question, which you anticipated, but I'd like to interrupt. You know, recreational murders are now the latest fad. Before, kids used to kill cats for fun, and it was a very cruel sport. Now people kill humans for fun. And when you look, I never quite put two and two together, but I think I see at least some of the reason for these movies. You hear the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Freddy Krueger movies, the various Slice 'em Dice 'em movies, and they're exposed to such graphic, sinister, macabre violence that it can't help but cheapen human life and desensitize them. I mean, even cartoons for children are like this.
Well, when people pay to see grisly and gruesome violence as a form of entertainment, you are cultivating a serious, serious problem. And that is going to go outside the movie theater. And it's going to be evident in the way people treat each other. When viciousness becomes entertaining, then watch out, because you're going to be living in a very, very vicious world. People who cut their teeth on that are going to use those teeth. And it's going to be very ugly.
Well, people have become very calloused by watching these movies, seeing these things, and they've lost any sense of sacredness of the human life. And along with that, because human life is not sacred, they try to hide death or portray it as being something of no consequence. So you see abortion, you see murder, you see all of the crimes being committed, vicious crimes.
Well, Father Skierke, I was going to ask you something moving into our next sin that cries to heaven for vengeance, sodomy. I believe that in most cases no one would deny the malice of willful murder, except, of course, in the exceptions of abortion and euthanasia. But we read in chapter 18 of Genesis the following, "And the Lord said, the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is multiplied, and their sin has become exceedingly grievous." Why is the sin of sodomy or unnatural vice so detestable in the eyes of God? In fact, many today would say, well, look, what's wrong with it? I may not choose to practice it, but who am I to have someone else obey my moral dictates? And, you know, as long as they leave me alone, that's fine.
Well, it goes contrary to God's law. It goes against nature itself. God created man for a certain purpose, and for a man to go against that, it becomes unnatural. Just as if you had the animal world act contrary to as God created it, even the inanimate objects, if they acted contrary to what God made them, it would become a chaotic world and would go against the very purpose for which God created them.
Father Jenkins.
Well, it is an evil thing. It's a perversion. Perversion. I mean, God created the male and female for a purpose. He created the male and female so they could bring forth new human life. To use the sexual powers and direct the sexual appetites towards something that is essentially contrary to that purpose is a perversion. In fact, you know, the sin of sodomy is just the tip of the iceberg of how perverse homosexual relations become. You know, we couldn't even go into them. Into talking about them. But the thing about such vices is that they take over. They take over. Either they are withheld and repressed by an individual simply because they are morally wrong, or they take him over and control him. it's almost as though they're dominated or driven or obsessed by this need to fulfill a vice like this. And I think this is why people tend to have a reasonable fear about the whole controversy surrounding allowing homosexuals freely to circulate in the military. The same thing will happen in the military as has happened in the modern Vatican II seminaries. You know, even some very liberal theologians, such as Father McBrien, former chair of the theology department at Notre Dame, and you know, sociologists like Andrew Greeley. Now, these men are not conservatives or reactionaries, as the press might call them, but even they have come out publicly and expressed their worry that the modern seminaries are being taken over by the homosexual element. They came out a couple of years ago and said that over 50% of the seminarians in the modern seminaries were homosexual. They said the consequence of this was that the non-homosexuals were being driven out of the seminary. The homosexuals were promoting each other to positions of influence. Now, their only concern was that later on down the line, some years from now, non-homosexual parishioners will not have a non-homosexual priest to guide them. They will only have homosexual priests over them. That should be a warning to anybody who still frequents this new religion of Vatican II. But my point is, the same thing's going to happen in the military that happened in the seminaries. The homosexuals, they do stick together. They do promote each other. Homosexuality for them is a religion. It is a mania. They cannot control it. It controls them. And what you're going to have in the course of time is you're going to have the homosexuals gradually moving in more and more, dominating in the military. Non-homosexuals are going to be an oppressed minority. They can deny it all they want, but it's going to happen. And you're going to have the firepower of the United States military in the hands of a homosexual military service, is what you're going to have. And then you're really going to see a nation held at gunpoint. They are zealots. A vice like this takes over, and it brooks no restraint from anyone, and anyone who tries to restrain it is the enemy.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing Reverend Full.
James, one of the reasons why this sin is so abhorrent to God is because of the principle corruptio optimi passiva. The corruption of the best thing is the worst corruption of all. And if you were to look at the natural gifts that God has given to mankind, surely the ability to bring forth new human life, offspring, is one of the most magnificent gifts that God could give to man. God created the first two individuals, Adam and Eve. But from that moment, he gave the responsibility for bringing forth new human life into existence through them, only through the marital relations of a man and a woman. This is such a terrific gift that we could not even conceive of this being done had God not simply given it to us. And to pervert that is a gross, gross insult, and it is really a corruption of one of the best and most beautiful things God has done for us.
I'd like to interrupt, just maybe take a little bit of a detour just for a moment and read you a letter that we received from one of our viewers who came to the traditional Mass as a result of What Catholics Believe. In fact, it was addressed to you. These are viewers in Brunswick, Georgia. They said as follows: Dear Father Jenkins, we finally made it home. We are now attending St. Michael the Archangel Church, and all four of us are happy, and we cannot describe to you the peace of mind and just peace we have all experienced. It's about 150 miles round trip every Sunday. And all of us look forward to Sunday morning to rise at 5 o'clock, and believe it or not, 5 o'clock does not come early enough or fast enough. Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. The cross is still there, but it's not heavy anymore. Mary makes promises and keeps them. The rosary is the weapon, and we say it every day. Please continue to pray for us, and we will pray for all of you.
That's a beautiful letter.
God bless you. Mother Mary keep you with love. You know, we could spend...
Well, thank you for writing.
Oh, that's very, very beautiful, very moving. It makes the whole thing worth it. You know, our financial crises and it's much easier to bear than when you get letters like this and you see the concrete results. You know, I'd like to move forward and discuss some of the other sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. maybe we can lump them together, namely the oppression of the poor, widows, and orphans, and defrauding a laborer of just wages. There are scriptural references from the book of Exodus and the book of Proverbs relating to this. Could you first begin by describing the Catholic ideal or relationship between employers and employees? To what extent is it, or has it been realized in the United States?
Well, the ideal relationship between an employer and his employee is one of mutual responsibility. The employer must feel a responsibility towards his employee, and the employee must also have a sense of responsibility to his employer. Unfortunately, there's been a certain polarization that's gone on. A lot of it is a Marxist idea of class warfare, that the two are natural enemies because they are both accepted as being naturally and rightfully selfish, each looking out for his own interest, and therefore they're adversaries, necessarily adversaries. But that's not the Catholic idea. That's the socialist idea and the laissez-faire or mercantile capitalist idea, both of which go along with class warfare. Dog eat dog, get what you can. The battle, the race goes to the swiftest.
Survival of the fittest.
Right, all of that. That's the whole mentality of the 18th century, 19th century, and unfortunately 20th century economics. But actually, in taking on an employee, an employer does take on responsibility for him, for his welfare. First of all, he has to be concerned about the man's spiritual welfare. He's got to give him time to worship God. And he cannot make demands on his time that would preclude his ability to worship his Creator. And he's got to give him time to take care of his family. And that means more than just putting food in their mouths. That means spending time with them. And not time when he's so tired that he's irritable and has a hard time being a good father with them. I mean, the employer has to be responsible for it. When he employs somebody, he's got to employ him not as a slave who's just going to increase his the black ink in his ledger books. When he employs somebody, he should be concerned about that man as an individual, as a father, as a husband, and he should take a personal interest in whether that man's family is being well served by him, and whether he as an employer is making it possible for the man to do that. He should take responsibility, of course, to see that he is well paid. What is a just wage? Well, a just wage is, according to the Church, having enough money coming in to pay the bills for what is necessary: food, shelter, clothing, and beyond that, for a person to buy comforts of life, reasonable comforts, and to have something left over for security's sake for the future. Right. And now, unfortunately, many of the people today are living at or beyond their means. The employer cannot do much about that. He can't dictate, what the individual spends his money on. It's a matter of the individual's morality. But to see that he has enough to provide for his family and have a little bit of a cushion also to provide for their future security, that's his responsibility. Unfortunately, now government wants to take over more and more of the welfare mentality. There really is socialism behind the idea of providing this necessity and that necessity, so that people become more and more dependent upon government to provide the necessities of their lives. But the small businessmen, for example, I don't know how they define exactly what a small businessman is. I guess there's some regulation somewhere which states what that is. But they seem to be closer to the employee and more concerned about his influence than the major
huge multinational companies.
Sure,
right.
To which the employee is nothing but a number.
Right.
And so they're the ones who should be bolstered by government instead of driven to the wall by regulations which practically regulate them out of existence.
What's happening in our current social structure is that more and more of the smaller and medium-sized companies are being swallowed up by the mega companies. There's a whole movement which is gaining tremendous impetus, so-called free trade. Now, this apparently is knocking down any kind of restrictions or trade barriers before countries. And so we hear now that we have to compete in a global economy. But it's interesting that this goes directly against the principles of St. Thomas Aquinas, who in his Summa Theologica enunciated the principle of national self-sufficiency. He said a country should be able to produce as much of what it needs as possible, because once you start trading with someone, their way of life is going to influence your way of life. And, you know, we see this example right now with, say, General Motors laying off 70,000 people over the next number of years, and the same day that announcement is made, they're building a factory in Red China, which is going to employ 10,000 employees, probably pay the workers there an absolutely, you know, abysmally low wage, and then sell the product here at a reduced cost, putting additional pressure on the competition that tries to manufacture things here.
It's nothing but economic adultery, is all it is, like financial adultery, to do that. It's as though they have no responsibility toward the nation. You know, the virtue of piety is the virtue which makes us beholden to our own parents and love them. And we have an obligation to love our parents more than we love other people. We have an obligation to love everybody. But for some people, the obligation is stronger. And so it is with our country. By the same virtue, piety, we are obliged to love our country and to look out for our country, to promote our country, not to do anything unjust against anyone else. But our country, our love for our country, should go beyond our love for, let's say, the other nations of the world. We must never be unjust, and we must certainly show mercy. But charity does begin at home. And so this is our first responsibility. We could not take the food out of the mouths of our own children and put them in the mouths of someone else's children. That would be a sin to do that. And that's what they're doing when they, by this free trade agreement and so on. By the way, you know that Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson, that great convert to the faith back in the, about the turn of the 1900s, wrote a book called The Lord of the World, in which he talked about the circumstances surrounding the coming of the Antichrist. And one of the provisions that was implemented worldwide as a precondition for the coming of the Antichrist was this free trade among all the nations of the world, an essential element toward a one-world government.
Well, there's no doubt about it, and you know, one of the problems I see is how are you going to compete with someone who works for 30 cents an hour and is beaten, or just about, if he doesn't work hard enough, when you're trying to pay your workers a just wage? Of course,
so you
you're
have an American who has a choice between either accepting 30 cents an hour or not having a job at all.
That's right.
That's not right.
That's right.
There's no understanding of justice. Everything, as Father Jenkins mentioned, is perverted. And if you speak of justice, we can go one step back further. We were talking about one of the other sins of sodomy. There's no sense of justice in the sense that there's no distinction between good and evil. In fact, it's such that evil has the same rights as good. And with that in mind, there's no problem then with that understanding of buying from China, putting our own workers out of work. Because there is no real absolute reality of what justice is.
What even about the situation, I mean, would this be one of the crimes that cry to heaven for vengeance? As a company is faced with a situation where they want to improve the bottom line and raise the value of the stock, so they just lay off thousands of workers or hundreds of workers, as the case may be, and they're really in no danger of insolvency. Can that be justified?
No. It's a crime. It's a sin. Right. Very serious sin.
And even, right. The other corollary to that is if a company is a publicly held company, I know this might be have a bit of a thorny issue, does a company have its first responsibility towards its employees or toward its stockholders?
Well, a company has an obligation toward both, of course. But it has an obligation toward those who are more dependent upon it, obviously, and that would involve the employees. I consider these layoffs to be, again, a kind of financial abortion, where these people are inconvenient, and we can do much better without them, so let's get rid of them.
Make the remaining ones work twice as hard in very stressful conditions.
It's like financial homicide. Right. It's very, very evil. But, Julius, it really comes down to a total breakdown in morality. And this globalism that they're pushing requires that there be a destruction of the conscience in people, because the conscience and any sense of morality stands in the way of the globalist mentality. Everybody in the whole world has to be looked upon as just a servant of the world community. His existence can only be justified by his service to the world community, and it's wrong. We have to pray the rosary for Our Lady of Fatima that this can be turned around.
You've been watching what Catholics